Hello everyone, my name is Joshua Moore, and for my group project we're going to be covering Sexuality and Disability 1-hour continuing education course. This course has been made compliant with the National Board of Certified Counselors Continuing Education Standards. Our learning objectives are to recall basic introductory sexual issues related to hereditary disability, outline changes and challenges in sexuality related to aging, and identify the basic sexual challenges facing disabled veterans. Recommendations and feedback. At the end of the class, feedback forms will be distributed. Your feedback is very important. That information is kept for 5 years. If there's any complaints, they can be given to the phone number below. If pending approval or pending certification, this information will be given to the National Board of Certified Counselors within 60 days, and those complaints would be held for 5 years. Disability rights. Every participant has the right to the content of this presentation. In the case of visual or auditory disability, individual accommodations would be made to ensure each participant has reasonable access to the information that is presented. Content restrictions. This content is not to be distributed outside of the classroom and is not approved for copy or distribution in part or whole without the consent of Lindsay Bertram, Jeremy Pumphrey, or Joshua Moore. The media content of this presentation is owned or used with permission by Lindsay Bertram, Jeremy Pumphrey, and or Joshua Moore. For my section, I'll be covering sexuality and disability. I am a veteran, so I'll be covering the section of veterans, and I was actually the frontline medical receiver as an orthopedic specialist at Walter Reed. We'll cover the role of Walter Reed and how this plays into sexuality and disability with veterans. First of all, Williams and Jazur in 2013 conducted a large comprehensive study on military injuries. For the past 12 years, from 2013 to 2001, 50,000 injuries occurred. 5% of those injuries involve the genitourinary tract, which is like the renal system, everything up to the renal system, bladder, scrotum, penis, prostate, etc. 70% of genitourinary injuries included the external genitalia. Genitourinary injuries is worth acknowledging because it can still affect things like sexual function, sexual identity, and hormones. And so there's a lot of reasons why we'd include the entire system and not just, the penis or the scrotum. First of all, let's talk about what they experienced. There's a 5-step medical evacuation process when there's an injury. That injury goes from patching them up with a combat medic, sending them to a forward operating base. The forwarding operating base will patch them to a transit center and send them to usually Landstuhl, Germany. If there's availability, they'll do forward surgical there very quickly, and then life flight them to Walter Reed, which is typically the frontline medical reception center with a few exceptions. And that's actually where I worked, and my job was to receive the life flights as the orthopedic specialist, and I conducted the triage of the wounded warriors that were being flown in, and immediate medical treatment, and then typically would assist in later care, surgical or wound care, etc. throughout the day. We did those 3 days a week or 3 nights a week. Blast injuries were nearly all of those cases, and they're in all serious cases, they were almost always blast injuries, and all of those injuries are highly comorbid. Consistent with my experience, William and Jazur found that the average amount of amputations was about 2. It was unusual to see less than 2 amputations. It was unusual to see more than 3. Injuries could just be internal with very little visual indicators, and this is true in a number of ways. And with women that don't have as much external tissue for damage, there's still a lot of internal cavities like the uterus that can take damage. And there wasn't very many females that were life-flighted, and those statistics are covered by William and Jazur. During my stay, there was only 1 woman who was life-flighted to us out of hundreds of men. So it's not that common, but in those cases, you are dealing with different internal injuries. But even with men, we have to take into account that the injuries might not be as obvious. Some of those could be internal bleeding, or it could be that some of those internal genitourinary systems are damaged and will have to be addressed down the road once the individual is stable. Most of the injuries outside of the genitourinary system would take priority for several months. There would usually be a urologist who would actually give them some comfort and answer their questions, so to satiate some of their anxieties about their sexual function. But a lot of those were just kind of on the back burner for months until we had the time, the resources, and we could make it a priority. According to Williams and Jazor, if 50% of the tissue of the penis was intact, usually it could be reconstructed successfully to preserve size, function, directionality, etc. Which is impressive that they can do that, by the way. If less than 50%, then they would make some pretty severe compromises in the reconstruction process. The psychological impact of genital injury, as assessed by Williams and Jazor, the genital injuries are usually the most sought after questions of the soldiers coming from the life flights. And that is something that I also witnessed as well. It was in my best interest to keep, an anesthesiologist nearby so I could perform basic interventions, as well as a urologist to calm them down. So the urologist was there just to keep their blood pressure lower. I can't do interventions if their blood pressure isn't low enough. It's dangerous. And so the urologist was there for blood pressure management, which is really just anxiety management, answering their questions about sexual function. Things are going to be all right, usually. Things are going to be okay. This is what we're going to go through. This is how we're going to help you. And that is the most, in multiple studies, it's actually cited that that's the most significant thing on their mind when they're initially coming back. That maintains different steps, during the first year of treatment within the hospital. They get a lot of modeling on how soldiers do physiologically with amputations. They see people who are worse off than them being highly mobile, and so they get a lot of their answers just through basic modeling in the hospital. On mobility with amputations, but they don't get as many answers to their sexual function questions about, they don't have any modeling for that. They don't know, they don't have an idea of what that's going to look like. And they do crave a lot more information about that on a regular basis. And it isn't oftentimes the first thing that people, therapists or medical doctors think to talk to them about or ask them about. So Lucas, Page, and Bennett in 2014 conducted the first, at least they claimed it was the first qualitative study on veterans with genital injuries. There were 13 veterans. They gathered a number of statistics about these 13 veterans and then asked them 27 open-ended questions about their experience. And these questions ranged from, what was your experience with your initial injury? What was it like being life-flighted? How do you feel about your sexuality? How does your partner feel about your sexuality? How much hope or do you have towards things being better in the future? Those kinds of things. And they found a number of interesting trends. It's well worth the reading if you have the interest. But one of the first thing they found was that soldiers were typically quite open with clinicians, but they were usually far more reserved with their friends and family. It was very quick for them to open up to the doctors, not so much with friends or family. Sexual dysfunction was reported to be far more distressing than even their amputations. And the average individual had about 2 amputations again. But again, they had lots of positive modeling around that. It wasn't hard for them to see that they were going to be okay. They had examples to look after. Following injury and following that deployment, monogamy was extremely common in these 13 veterans. They noticed that a tendency to be monogamous was extremely high, even if asking questions about their sexuality showed that they were serial monogamous or they had a lot of sexual partners before the deployment. That wasn't the case following deployment. They tend to stay monogamous. The Dismounted Complex Blast Injury Task Force in 2011 conducted a very large, comprehensive study on the mental health challenges of soldiers, and they did cover genital injured soldiers. It was a very holistic study. They did contrast genital injured soldiers with non-genital injured soldiers, and that information was extremely helpful in showing that they got more depressed. They had higher rates of PTSD. They had more severe PTSD than soldiers with comparable injuries that were non-genital related. So you could say amputations and, a year plus hospitalization. Both of those categories, one with genital injuries, one with not. Worse depression, worse PTSD, more likely to have PTSD. Their mental health healing was slower, and there was less successful healing in long-term recovering of their physical injuries. So there was less motivation potentially in physical therapy. The variables there weren't exactly known, but that they healed slower, both physically and mentally, compared to someone that had very similar injuries but not related to the genitals. So counseling considerations. This is actually a really interesting one. The first thing we have to cover when talking about the military is that there is a culture there. It is a specific subculture. In the military, there's things that they use that can be referred to as language cants. There are things that sound like one thing but don't mean that. And people in the military know what those things are. And people on the civilian side think they understood it, but they really didn't. So there can be this kind of secret language in a way that is kind of designed to kind of speak to someone across the room almost kind of elusively. And there are some very strong tendencies like that, where someone says, that person's a blue falcon, it's not a good thing, and some of those languages are used a lot. There's a lot of different acronyms, and you'll notice around acronyms that are used extremely commonly, there's often a disregard or an unacknowledgement of how others do not understand those acronyms. Maybe they're assuming that those are understood, or quite possibly they just don't care. And then body language in the military is not universal to Western culture. Body language in the military has lots of different rules, and there's more hierarchical structures about when and why they do what they do. And if you don't have cultural competency with military, you're not going to necessarily understand what's happening in the room psychodynamically with you and your client. You aren't going to read that body language correctly. You might see it, as one thing, and it might mean something very different. So what one thing might be viewed as respect, it's really discomfort. And you got to know your local resources and understand how those local resources or what those resources look like. The military has a very different way of approaching some of the resources they put out there on the internet. One common trend, which can be very frustrating and surprising to therapists who don't specialize in soldiers, they might go online to find resources for these soldiers and end up giving referrals that don't work. And the reason why they don't work is because the military will regularly put up these websites with phone numbers, resources, message boards, etc., and then integrate that into another system later. They don't actually take the old website down. The switchboards are still there, the voicemails are still there, the website's still there, there's still this portal to email questions, there's still login pages, but they haven't been used in years. They just don't take them down. So there's a lot of that. And we'll talk about that before the end of how do you mitigate that? How do you know what to do with that? But you can't just go on Google and just pull a site off of there and give it to your client. It's not going to work. The military, that's not going to work. People in the military know this. So Lucas et al. In 2014 found that these soldiers wanted their healthcare workers to talk to them more about their sexuality. That there's actually many, many studies that said that actually. They want to be asked directly about their sexuality. And they want to be asked a lot more often than you might think they want to be asked. You might realize that they have an amputation that's the most visible thing, and you can see them struggling with it, but that might not be what's on their mind. That might not be where their insecurities are. They might have had, going through Walter Reed, a lot of positive modeling for the clinic of the the Clinic of the Excalibur, I believe it's called, where they teach them literally how to hike Mount Kilimanjaro, and they do, some of them do that, you know, with like one arm. But so they have a lot of positive modeling around mobility, and they have very strong positive beliefs sometimes about where they're going, but they don't have the same modeling for their sexuality, even though some of those things very well could be true. There is an open modeling for that. And also, again, the healthcare workers, counselors, doctors, if they don't ask often enough, they're not going to have their questions answered. They're not going to be able to work on where their insecurities actually lie, which is going to be primarily around their sexuality statistically. So also with military culture, you can ask your questions and you can ask them directly. Okay, you're also going to notice that they might very likely appear very comfortable answering your questions. They might feel in this hierarchical way that you are owed that information because of your position, and that it's your role to get that information, it's their role to disclose it, and they're doing their duty. And it might give you the impression that they talk about this more casually or that they're more comfortable with it, and that might not actually be true. So you do have to actually set aside maybe this initial, more natural assumption that, oh, they talk really comfortably about this. But when you ask, do you talk to your spouse about your sexuality or about these concerns? You might be surprised to find, no, they're very uncomfortable with that. They don't know how to do that. And a simple way to address that is, like the way that you discussed it with me was a very effective way that you could discuss that with your spouse. That you did it very well right here. I suspect that would work really well for you in your interpersonal life. But that's not going to be obvious to them. They have to be coached on that. And again, you have to check that comfortability. You can't assume that what's happening in the room with you is a good projection of what's happening in their life. And that transfer, that psychodynamic transfer from what happens in the room being transferred to other groups within their life, that has to be more intentionally addressed, that we don't see that psychodynamic, what we do here becomes a prediction of what will be created in the future. You have to actually say that. You have to actually talk about doing it outside of the office, because there's some rules and some compartmentalization that you just might not have as strongly in civilian sectors. Okay, so let's get back on track here. Wilcox, Schumer, Hansen, AM in 2015 found that TRICARE does not have specializations for sexuality and sexual function, but specialization was actually needed. And so their consensus was, we've got to work on this. There isn't currently any specialization in TRICARE, which is the military insurance that they have. But they oftentimes do need specific marital coaching with amputations and damage to sexual function. Sex is a very intimidating idea sometimes. It doesn't work the same way that it did. They need some very specific coaching and counseling, and they're going to have to do some exercises. So the individual who wants to do this work with them might have to be a sex therapist. And if it was that simple, that'd be great, but it's going to get more complicated. There's a lot of crossover with, say, traumatic brain injury. About as many people that had genitourinary injuries also had concussions, and the overlap was at least 40%, according to Williams and Gisor. And that, I think the concussions are very often underreported, by the way, and they're starting to realize that. At least while I was at Walter Reed, they were like, yeah, this is not okay. So we suspect the statistics are are really, really low. That if you have a blast injury to soft tissue of your body, you probably have a concussion. Okay. So we are likely or probable to be dealing with concussion syndrome or traumatic brain injury. You can also add in that you are likely to see PTSD. You're not going to have a very easy time trying to separate what symptoms are due to PTSD and what symptoms are due to concussion syndrome. I don't think you can separate them. So you might have to be willing to specialize in a couple different things, or know a moderate amount about a couple different types of therapies, and they're all going to come up together. You're not going to be able to say, well, let's just work on this today. they're all highly comorbid. They all interact with each other. And the chances of getting all three of those are reasonable. So let's talk a little bit about resources for you as a therapist if you want to go further and learn more about this, if you'd like to work towards helping veterans or contracting with the VA. The first place you probably should stop off at is the militaryonesource.mil. And Military One Source is going to take a lot of the actual active veterans services, and it's going to keep it all updated for you. And it's going to keep it organized for you, and it's going to have an interface that looks more like a civilian interface. It's not going to be, so sterile. It's going to look nice, and it's going to feel intuitive, interactive, and you're going to find things when you're looking for them. They also, through Military One Source, if you're just getting referrals, they'll connect individuals with free counseling in their area. And so veterans, to a degree, can get free counseling through Military One Source. They'll connect them to free counseling. If you want to offer free counseling, Military One Source can be a great place to get some training and volunteer. And they'll very easily put you on those databases for that. And that website will connect you to, again, everything out there that's updated. And you can always just call if you have questions. They'll just talk to you. The vetcenter.va.gov is a great place to see an overview of services and get that information kind of broken down into more local areas. When you find your local VA clinic, I recommend that you just call them and create dialogue with them. They'll be happy to talk to you as a therapist. They'll be happy to offer resources. They'll ask you about whether you want to teach classes. They'll ask you if you want to take classes. Get to know them just a little bit, and they might start talking about contracts to send soldiers your way. We find it very quickly. They start talking about, hey, is there any way you want to contract? And so if you feel like you're in the position where you're ready, that's where you should start. All right, so here's some references for you that we covered. There's a lot of information here that we didn't really go over. Some of these are like hundreds of pages long. And I did cover a lot of the data. So if you have any questions, specific to their experience, specific to the statistics, or specific to the process, as I said, I have a lot of personal experience and a lot of careful study. I'd be happy to answer any of the questions that you have. And I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you go on to enjoy the rest of the presentation that Lindsay Bertram and Jeremy Pumphrey have to offer. Thank you very much for your time.